When Trevor asked me to speak, he didn't tell me that I was going to be the first one. So let me take a minute to introduce some work that my colleagues at Resources for the Future have done to set up the discussion about the proposed legislation. And then I'll spend most of my time talking about some numbers to set up the discussion. The US numbers, what are the costs and the trade numbers are likely to be. And then I'll just end with what little bit I know about the European studies. So, a year ago, RFF produced this Assessing U.S. Climate Policy Options. It's in the form of policy briefs, non-technical, geared towards the policy community. And this chart is an update of that. It's on our website somewhere. I don't really quite intend for you to actually be able to read this. This is just to illustrate the number of bills that has been submitted in the previous Congress to deal with this climate problem. The green line is the Lieberman-Warner bill that is the most analyzed one. That is what the EPA has spent a lot of effort analyzing. So what I want to mention then is, again, you probably can't see this, is that for every one of these bills, there is some language dealing with the competitiveness issue. And so I put a ... there. So in the table on the website, there will be discussion about the quota allocations, the international offsets, and other topics. But one of these columns is the mechanisms in the bills to deal with this import leakage. So I'll leave it there. So let me now turn to the work that Richard Morgenstern and I and Ji-Shang have done. So this paper is an update of a chapter in this book. And we discuss the carbon policy effects on output and the trade impacts. So most of you here are familiar with many of the analysis using what they call computable models. And many of these models have chosen to focus on the number of different countries at the expense of industry detail. So one of the better known ones is the MIT model with quite a number of regions, but only about a dozen industries. And many of these models also do not distinguish between the short run and long run. Most of them are long run analysis. So what we have tried to do here is to focus only on US unilateral policy, but to expand the industry dimension, and also to think a little bit more carefully about the time dimension. So what we like to emphasize in this study is, in the long run, the effects on profits and output may be worse or less than the short-run impact. So we think about 4 horizons. The very short run is what I think of as the maximum damage that the industry lobbyists will be claiming, that they cannot change any quantities, they cannot substitute for cheaper inputs, and they cannot sell at higher prices, and they have to absorb the higher costs of the inputs. And what we call the long run is when we think that they are allowed to raise their prices and suffer some small reduction in sales and output. And then in the medium term, we consider the scenario where they are allowed to substitute less carbon-intensive inputs for the more expensive taxed inputs. And then the long run where we can move capital around and substitute capital for energy inputs. So what is the magnitude of the energy costs? So in the paper, we report the 52 industries, and here I've only picked up the 12, the top 6 of them. For all of manufacturing, energy cost is only a trivial 3% of total costs. And this includes capital costs. And the US, unlike the Europe, is a relatively insular economy. Even for manufacturing goods, in the year 2002, only 13% of domestic consumption is imported. When we include raw materials like crude oil, the import to GDP ratio for the US is only about 14%. So this is quite different from the European scenario. But what I like to emphasize here is that for particular products, the energy costs are more than 20-30% of total costs. And for these commodities, they are also very exposed to international competition. Even cement, this very heavy, expensive to transport cement, has a 14% import share. And for paper and pulp, they are in excess of 40%. So this is a very serious issue for some industry groups. So this is the first part of our analysis, where we ask what is the difference between the short-run and long-run impact on profits, on costs and profits of a modest tax on carbon, a $10 in 2005 dollars per ton of carbon dioxide. So even with this modest tax, for other basic inorganic chemicals, the last line, the green line represents the very short run, when no quantities are allowed to change, and the blue bars are the short run, where we allow them to raise prices and pass on some of the costs. So if they are not allowed to pass on the costs, this modest tax would raise costs by 2% or even up to 8%. So for these particular commodity groups, it's going to be a very big impact if we are talking about a $40 per ton carbon tax as envisaged in some of the analysis of the Lieberman-Warner bill. However, if we imagine that they're not going to sit there and just absorb this higher cost, but they try to pass on some of this, then they would suffer some loss of sales and output, but the reduction the reduction in the hit to the profits is very substantial even for this group. So one thing that we like to emphasize then, that when we think about policies and compensation for industries, we want to think about how things should evolve over time. This is the impact on output, and if you like, employment, if employment is proportional to output. So for petrochemical manufacturing, we are projecting from this modest $10 per ton tax, a reduction in sales and output of 7%. And so on up this is the top 10 list. So cement is very energy intensive and fairly elastic with the demand, so they suffer a 4% loss, all the way down to lime and gypsum, about 2%. So most of these industries are within the chemicals group. So we are talking about basically chemicals, non-metallic mineral products, and primary metals. We then turn to a longer-term analysis where we say, well, we think that firms will be substituting less carbon-intensive, cheaper inputs after we put a carbon regime into place. And for this purpose, then we turn to a general equilibrium model, a world model. And when we do that, we were no longer able to do at that level of detail of industry classification. So I took a model from Richard Gabacho and Atkins, two people that used to work at the EPA. And this is a model with 24 regions and 21 countries. And the green bar is the short-run output effect from the previous slide. And the blue bar is the long-run impact when we allow inputs to substitute. So for most cases, the long-run impact is smaller than the short-run impact. When we are allowed to substitute for cheaper inputs, we would suffer a bigger hit to our costs, and we would not have to raise our prices so much. And when we raise our prices less, we would suffer a smaller loss of sales and output. The exception is our assumption of the petroleum refining sector, Here, we assume that in the short run, motor vehicles cannot get away from using gasoline. And so in the short run, they have to buy the same amount of gasoline. But over the longer term, we are going to substitute towards smaller cars or more energy efficient cars. And the long run output in this case then suffers a bigger decline in sales for the refining sector. So again, the lesson is that when we take a longer perspective, the hit to companies' profits and output would be smaller. So now we turn to the topic at hand, which is what is the trade impact of a policy like this? So just to illustrate this, I'm starting here with chemicals. Again, this is at the 2-digit level. So this includes all the details, industries of fertilizer, inorganic chemicals, petrochemical manufacturing. So we project in the long run about a 1.3% reduction in output from this modest tax. And what is this change in output made up of? It's about a 60% due to a reduction in domestic consumption because things are now more expensive and we use less. But there's a trade impact of about 45%. So there is a reduction of exports as U.S. Producers have to raise the price to cover the higher costs. And as imports, the cheaper imports now are more attractive to buyers. So chemicals is one of these high energy costs, highly trade exposed sectors. And for these, we are talking about a leakage rate in excess of 40%. So these are 3 other commodity groups. So for non-metallic mineral products, that is to say cement, clay, and glass, again, we are talking about a leakage rate of 40%, right? So international production of these goods will be 40% of the U.S. reduction. So in terms of the carbon leakage, if they produce these goods with the same carbon intensity, we are talking about 40% leakage. But if there are more carbon-intensive technologies used abroad, then the leakage rate will be even bigger than 40% for these particular products. So primary metals is iron and steel, aluminum, and so on, and that's about more than 30%. Textiles is a bit smaller. Textiles is less energy intensive than the others, and so suffer a smaller leakage rate. So the complete set of the commodities is given in the paper. So we can see that the leakage rate ranges from about 10% to this 40%. And this is only the manufacturing commodities. So one caveat right away that I want to note that this is done using a general equilibrium model. Unfortunately, for those of you who remember, this is the Institute of International Economics. There was a lot of analysis done for the North American Free Trade Agreement. I have to sad to say the record of general equilibrium modeling of these effects of NAFTA was very poor. The actual trade flows after NAFTA was much larger than what economists have modeled. This is a point that Patrick Kehoe has made very strongly. That is to say, this impact here may well be understated if the experience of NAFTA is repeated. That is to say, the model effect of NAFTA and the actual effects that we saw, that is much larger. So there's one big caveat that I want to note. So if industry lobbyists come and say, well, we believe that the whole of the inorganic chemical industry will be destroyed, then it's not beyond the realm of possibility. So finally then, let me just quickly mention the 2 EU studies at the very disaggregated industries that I'm aware of. So one is done by McKinsey and one is done by the International Energy Agency by Renault. So again, we took the numbers and we normalized it to the same $10 per ton carbon dioxide tax. So the first line is basic oxygen furnace steel, and they suffer this huge 6% cost increase from this modest tax. So the first column is what is the cost increase due to a carbon tax. So cement is the one that is hit the most with the 13% because they include for cement not just the fossil fuel use but also the process emission. And the very last row is petroleum refining, a 7.4% hit to costs. In the second column is that if they were given allowances, 95% of the allowances for free, what would be the net cost to them? In that case, then basic oxygen furnace, the 6% cost drops down to only a 1% cost. But in the case of electric arc furnace, these allowances are based only on their primary combustion of how much coal and oil that they burn and not the electricity used. In that case, then this electric furnace do not gain much from this free allowance. The third column is when we consider the fact that they should be raising their prices and they might suffer some reduction in sales, but they should be able to recoup some of these costs. And in the case of cement in some cases is relatively inelastic with very little competition. So although they have a big hit to cost, they are given these free quotas that are very valuable that they can sell, and they can actually turn around and make a profit out of this policy. So again, down there in the last row, I don't have a point in the last row here, petroleum refining, given this free quota, may well turn a profit. I just want to note that these numbers here, we do not study in our paper with Morgenstern at this level of detail, but our iron and steel is 2%, sort of a very close average of these figures. And our cement, because we do not include process emissions in our calculation, is just for fuel use is a 5% hit. So again, it's a very large hit for these commodities from even a very modest tax. So I guess the message is they are potentially very huge trade leakage, and it points to the urgency of finding a multilateral solution that we can reduce this leakage. So I think I should stop here. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Despite what the agenda says, I am going second rather than third. My name is Thomas Legg, and I'm a program officer with the German Marshall Fund here in Washington, D.C. I would just like to give you a brief overview of what the experience of the European Union has been since Europe has been tackling with the climate change problem for the last 10 years or so. It has some experience which might be useful for the debate here in the United States. So I'm going to just provide a quick context about carbon leakage and the problem that it poses and the challenge that it poses, give a quick overview of what has happened in the European Union and how the EU experience is relevant for the American debate, and then talk a little bit about the EU climate and energy package, which was the major series of policies that were adopted after much late-night negotiations last December, which set a fairly ambitious series of targets for the European Union over the next 10 years or so. So the problem, as it's already been laid out, is that carbon dioxide is a transboundary pollutant, yet there are different prices in different parts of the world. So since different countries are approaching this with different series of policy measures, this poses a problem for countries that trade with each other. The problem of leakage, as defined in most of the literature, is reduction of carbon-intensive industry or relocation of carbon-intensive industry to locations outside the carbon trading area as a consequence of the carbon price. And the problem with this is, of course, that it provides no net reduction in carbon emissions, but it can actually lead to an increase in carbon emissions because the emissions because the standards in the new host country could be lower than those in the original country. So the European Union has been grappling with this issue. It's very politically relevant there, and but some of the measures that they propose, I think, could be quite interesting for the discussion here. As it happens, the European Union now has a functioning emissions trading scheme across 30 countries, not just the EU, but also some the members of the European Economic Area, including Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein. And this means that the EU now has an absolute cap on emissions from 40% of its economy, and in the next trading period from 2013, this will increase to 50% of the economy. So this means that there is a price, an actual price in carbon emissions. Another area of similarity is that the EU is a reasonably large geographical area with some similarities to the United States. It has the sort of high-density, energy-efficient cities that we know about, but it also has large areas of urban sprawl and many areas of heavy industry, declining heavy industry, that are nervous about the social and economic implications of a price in CO2. But there are some critical differences as well, and with apologies to any Europeans in the audience for the sort of gross simplification of this graph, I just wanted to give a quick description of the EU policy-making process under the codecision procedure, which is the way that the climate policies were adopted there. Basically, the European Commission has the right to propose legislation which is then transmitted to the European Parliament and the EU Council. The European Parliament is directly elected by the population of the 27 member states, and the EU Council represents the heads of state and government of those member states. They don't always agree. The European Parliament in the climate debate seemed to be leaning a little bit more towards the radical side, whereas the Council tends to be more sort of hard-bitten political realities, getting in the way of the idealistic approach that the Parliament often prefers. But they do negotiate, and the result is the legislation that's implemented in law. The point that I wanted to make, though, about this was that in the climate debate in Europe, the real negotiations took place at the Council, in other words, between the member states, heads of state and government, rather than the Parliament. The Parliament pretty much endorsed what the Council had agreed after its late-night negotiations last December. So this was just to say that the EU decision-making procedure is not so transferable. The example is not so transferable to the United States because we miss the critical element of Congress. The negotiations between 27 member states can be sometimes easier than getting the particular majority that's needed in Congress. So I think Europeans are aware of that. I also wanted to mention how long this process took. Europe has a long-term target of reducing its emissions by 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, and this is consistent with its goal to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. It also has a medium-term target, which is a political target that it wants to reduce emissions by between 25 and 40% below 1990 levels by 2020. The idea of a carbon tax was mooted in 1992, but it was politically unacceptable at the time. So instead, the European Commission proposed an emissions trading system. That should say proposed. Sorry for the obstruction there. Maybe I can get rid of that. This was proposed in 2001 and came into force in 2005 with the first phase, which is basically a pilot phase. The second phase in 2008 to 2012 is identical to the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, which is obviously not a coincidence. It's designed to help the EU meet its Kyoto targets, but it's legally separate. The emissions trading scheme would exist whether or not the Kyoto Protocol had ever come into force or not. But then this was the real shift in ambition was the EU climate and energy package, which was agreed last December. And this, or I should also say that the third phase the third phase was agreed in part of the EU climate and energy package, and that will cover the period up to 2020. And it's quite ambitious. It includes a 20% reduction in the industrialized area, in the industrialized sector of the EU below 1990 levels. So I just wanted also to mention the the other parts of the climate and energy package, which were this emission reduction I mentioned, an increase in the share of renewable energy, not just electricity, to 20%, and a 20% increase in energy efficiency, as well as some other measures like carbon capture and storage and fuel emission standards. And just for good measure, they included a commitment to reduce emissions to 30% below 1990 levels if other industrialized countries, really the United States in particular, would agree to comparable measures in Copenhagen. So really one of the most critical issues in the negotiations last December was this issue about economic competitiveness as a result of unilateral or unequal climate action in Europe. The cement industry warned that most clinker production would be relocated outside the European Union. And one of the industry alliances said that this could basically cause the deindustrialization of Europe due to higher electricity prices. But on the other hand, some of the empirical evidence that exists so far has only found limited results of leakage. The IEA report, which was referred to, said that climate policy would only negatively impact the competitiveness of a few manufacturing industries, and is likely to have a fairly limited effect on output and employment levels. And there was a study by Carsten Neuhoff and his colleagues, which said that in Germany and the UK, only 1 or 2% of GDP is associated with activities that face significant cost increases from carbon pricing. But the point was made already that this is a real problem on the margins. And the European Commission did a study last September in which they looked at those industries which have a particularly high part of their cost coming from carbon-based energy. And this is a very busy graph. It's too detailed to read, but the triangle on the far right is aluminium. Oh, I'm sorry, that's clinker. But aluminium is also particularly affected. The industries are only affected if they are trading internationally. That was the significance of this. That there are some industries that simply don't trade very much. The IEA study that was mentioned also found that the studies tend to underestimate the impact of climate policy on employment. So even though there could be a net hit to particular industries, this could be offset by employment in other industries through, for instance, the deployment of renewable electricity or energy efficiency. So the climate and energy package that the European Union adopted has some specific measures to deal with the competitiveness issue. I'll just go through a few of them. One of them is that the emissions trading itself is quite a competition-friendly approach to dealing with carbon emissions because it finds the most efficient ways to reduce emissions. It's also selective. It doesn't cover the entire economy, and there are certain industries or certain sectors which are exempted. So, for instance, the transport sector isn't included yet. The multi-annual compliance periods allow for the market to deal with short-term price spikes or shocks, which could cause a very economically damaging increase in prices. Because it's a 5-year period, this smooths out these price differentials. And also the ability to bank and borrow permits is very important because it allows companies to smooth over the price across time periods. And if there's a particular force majeure, such as a spike in the international oil prices or a very cold winter, this is another reason for countries to allocate more emissions to the entities. So, but one of the most contentious and interesting for this discussion, the policy that was adopted in the European Union to deal with competitiveness was the allocation of emission trading permits for free. In the transition phase, this was done for 90% of the permits. And in the phase 3, the phase beginning in 2013, the agreement last December was that 60% of emission permits would be allocated for free. Sorry, would be auctioned. Only 40% would be allocated for free. And the electricity sector would have to buy all of its emission permits. Other sectors, this is where the real negotiations took place, I think. Other sectors managed to bargain their share of auctioning to 70% by 2020 and delaying actually until 2027 the full auctioning of permits. But even with that provision in place, there are some sectors that will be allowed to have will be allocated the permits for free. And these are the sectors which can demonstrate, using evidence, that they are at significant risk of carbon leakage. They will be given permits for free based on benchmarking of the most efficient processes that are currently in place. And the European Commission has not said which sectors will be included because they don't want to prejudice the outcome of the international negotiations. But they did issue a report last year which suggested that the sectors likely to benefit would be aluminum, hot rolled steel, and slabs and clinker. So they have this formula in the legislation that you can look at. This basically demonstrates that the real critical issue is the extent to which energy costs or carbon-based energy costs will increase the cost of the production, and also the extent to which the industries are trading internationally and therefore are not able to pass on the price to their consumers. There's also another provision if the emissions trading scheme increases their production costs by a very large amount, 30%. Another measure that was included in the climate and energy package was the Solidarity Fund. And this was basically a provision to give a certain chunk of the proceeds or a certain chunk of the permits to countries that are undergoing a transition from heavy industry to more efficient process. And this is particularly aimed at the Eastern European countries, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on, which have a lot of heavy industry left over from communist periods. And there is a final provision in the package, which is this carbon equalization system. It's not defined yet, but it basically says that if there is no global deal post-2012, then there may be a need to issue additional free allocations or include in some way, and it's not defined how, to include carbon-intensive imports from third countries in the European emissions trading scheme. So there is a couple of risks that I want to just mention briefly, which occurred in the European system, and I guess will be high in the minds of the American legislators when they're designing their own system here. One was the price volatility. This is the very old argument between the proponents of a carbon trading system and a carbon tax, which is that in the trading system you have a guaranteed environmental outcome, the cap is set, but you don't have a guaranteed price. And of course in Europe, the price of the permits from the first trading scheme from 2005 to 2007 collapsed very dramatically in 2006 when the data was published, which demonstrated that the initial allocation had been overgenerous, that they had calculated a baseline which was actually above the actual emissions from that period. So as soon as this was discovered, everyone realized they had more permits than they needed. And I think of the 27 countries that participated in the first phase, only the UK was a net buyer of permits, maybe one or two others as well. The second phase of the permits, of the trading scheme, is the dark line on top. And the key difference between the first and the second phase was that in the first phase you were not able to bank your unused permits for future commitment periods. In the second phase you are. And this is one of the reasons why the price has remained reasonably stable, not stable by